Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in February 2023. And we're going to have a nice panel about using DataDog for incident response. And hopefully this is also the beginning of a series of these very sort of practical sessions and trying to get industry to collaborate and trying to get us to talk about real world challenges that we have, and then get some of the players, in this case, DataDog, to actually provide real insight, real feedback, understand better the limitation of the platform. And of course, in my case, it's a loaded panel because, we are, okay, sorry. So it's a bit of a loaded panel because, I'm using DataDog and I really want to make sure we leverage the most out of it. So yeah, so I'm Dennis, I'm the CISO Holland Barrett. I'm also chief scientist of Glasswall, and I've actually used DataDog in both places, right? And I'm a big fan of a lot of the stuff he does. For this class, I'm also a big fan of Elastic, big fan of Splunk. I think there's places for a lot of these technologies, right? So, but I think it'd be really cool to explore, right? A lot of the capabilities and a lot of the possibilities and how to bridge the gap, right? Between the developers, the practitioners, the sec DevOps, security, the cloud architects, and the great places that DataDog gets the feed from. So maybe a quick intro. Laura, let me start with you, and then Nathan, and then we take it from there.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Laura Vesine. I'm a staff engineer at DataDog. I'm actually not in security at all. I'm in our SRE team, and I specialize aggressively in incident response. So I have lots of perspective on how we do incident response at DataDog, both for reliability incidents and for security incidents internally, and on the tooling that we've built around incident response at DataDog. Prior to DataDog, I've been at DataDog a little over a year. Prior to there, I was at Google for 5 years. So also doing largely incident response SRE work.
Cool. Nathan?
Hi, I'm Nate Case. I am a security geek at DataDog. I'm one of the people they pay to go talk to people about security. Very happy with that. Very much enjoy doing stuff like incident response. Before DataDog, I actually worked at a couple of companies focused on incident response. And one of the things that I did at AWS was incident response for our customers. Prior to that, I owned my own company, and we actually hosted what my business partner liked to call hard to host websites and systems. So really interesting government and awkward systems that people wanted to get into. So I had a really good time doing incident response for that, and then AWS, and now I get to talk about it, which is fun.
Cool. So let me frame some of the conversation, right? So one of the things that in security, right, and I think Nathan, we were talking a little bit about the fact that actually when we get security right, security disappears in a lot of ways, which I actually completely agree. But I always felt that in security, there's always this kind of thing of people talk about the 0 days and talk about the fact that the attackers have lots of advantage, the fact that the attackers have to find one thing and then that's it, right? Like almost like this asymmetric view of the world where the attackers have lots of advantage and defenders don't have them advantage, right? And I kind of, again, start my security journey on the attacker side, right? I found a lot of vulnerabilities, got paid for it, all legal, right? All good stuff. But I remember thinking that, a successful attack, right? It's like this great description, like a 0 day is not an invisibility cloak, right? It doesn't make you invisible. It might allow you to get to where you probably shouldn't be, but Correct. It doesn't mean that you achieved whatever business goal or malicious goal or, and again, there's different types of motivations, right? There's criminal, there's, intelligence, there's destruction, there's ideology, but whatever, let's say, goal an attacker has, right?
Yeah.
It's not because you happen to land in the middle of the vault that you've done it, right? You still have to do the things, right? And I always felt that the interesting conversation is not to say that we are completely defenseless and the attackers can figure all this stuff and do the thing on Christmas Eve or whatever, find the blind spots that we have, is to have a defense model that is based on the attackers making a mistake, right? One mistake, one little mistake, one medium mistake, one large mistake. And I would argue that the definition of a mistake is when they do something that no other user has done, or they did something malicious. Right. Because by design, right, a user does not give an order to somebody else, right? By design, a user doesn't blow up the website or a developer doesn't do that. So the logic
You
is that-
clearly haven't met my developer.
I was going to say, actually, there is
but they-
deployment, which is blowing up the website, but we'll
they
get to
don't
that
do-
in a minute.
Yes, but they don't do it on purpose, right? In fact, sometimes the bigger attackers are, internal
Yes.
people making mistakes, right? But the key point is that, if we have a system that we understand what good looks like, if you understand what are the good patterns, it becomes almost impossible for the attackers to do something, because by definition, it's going to be a weird thing, right? By definition, it's going to be something new.
Let me step back and let me define what 0 day is first.
Yeah.
So as we talk about a 0 day, it's someone's ability to access or do something that in some way, shape, or form shouldn't happen and nobody else knows about.
Mhm.
That's why we call it a 0 day. Once you've used it, then we kind of know it's there, and then we can figure out how to stop you and detect you. And that's all good. As we move into the cloud, though, when we start looking at what a cloud 0 day is, or as we look at like maybe more of these larger 0 days that are, hey, I'm going to get in and look at your infrastructure. I'm going to get in and look at your S3 bucket maybe, or I'm going to get in and look at your Azure blob. All of those things could be a 0 day. That's why that layered security defense really comes into play. And as we look at how we would evaluate that in a larger global sort of a way, I think you've very adequately pointed out that an attacker, anyone, is going to go do a thing. And as soon as you see that one thing that is outside the normative, that's one of the ways that we do threat detection. We can go ahead and say, hey, this is a thing, this is DNR, we're going to detect, and then we're going to respond to it, right?
Yeah.
And that's all good. It becomes more and more awkward the further you get security away from development to do that DNR. And that's why that's where I would completely agree with you. And I'm sure Laura would like to talk about the ability for development and DNR to conjoin. And as that begins to happen, as we look at the infrastructure as code, as we look at the development application, as we look at all of these things as a singular thing, as opposed to the way that we've been looking at it historically for the last 20 years, where they're segmented.
Yeah.
That's where we start to be able to see some of these really interesting layered security, layered defense concepts be able to come into play and say, okay, dude, cool. I'm happy that you made it through that first layer of defense. When you did, you had to pivot. And when you pivoted, Laura's team, the development team, found it. And then my team comes in as security incident response, and we take care of it and make sure you don't get anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these conversations that we're having, and Nathan, you alluded to this a little bit as well. These conversations and the way that we still have them kind of made sense 15, 20 years ago when we ran on-prem, we ran comparatively simple tech stacks. The modern tech company and the modern tech stack is incredibly complex. We've got, I don't know, 7 or 8 totally separate layers of infrastructure under the average thing that we're running in the cloud, right? If you think about sort of how do you get to bare metal, well, okay, even just on the cloud itself, right? You've got bare metal, you've got EC2, you've got typically Kubernetes on top of that. You've got whatever you've written on top of Kubernetes for your baseline infrastructure. You've got all the platforms that you're providing for your developers within that. You have this incredibly complex tech stack. And complex systems fail in complex ways, whether that's an intentional failure because somebody is attacking them, or whether that's because your developer doesn't understand the whole system, right? We have to build defense in depth for reliability just as much as we do for security. And I think one of the things that I see is that we're not sort of taking the same, that same philosophy and actually merging it together in a lot of places. We're not saying, you've already built defense in depth for reliability. How do we also build the same kind of defense in depth for security? Instead, it's getting added on as this layer on top, and it's getting added on as this layer, maybe at several layers of the tech stack if we're lucky. But why is it not being built in from the start, right? We ask our developers to design for reliability from the start. For example, I certainly wouldn't want to be at a modern tech company that says things like, it's fine if you go down if one Kubernetes pod fails. You have to design for that.
Yeah.
But I'm at modern tech companies all the time. And I speak to modern tech companies, and I think that this is fairly common, that, don't have a similar story for how do you design around security as a fundamental principle.
Yeah. And I think that the challenge there is the observability, right? So the reason why I'm a massive fan of logging and monitoring and understanding reality is because that's what allows you to bring context to a lot of the security discussions. And a lot of security, and I think security is as much as fault of this as everybody else, right? Is that a lot of the time security talks without context. And the problem with that is that the other side, and I've been on the other side, right? I think, when I move from offensive to defensive, I think I've learned a lot about having empathy, right? Because it's easy, you just fix it, right? Just do that. But when you actually try to freaking fix it, right? You understand the ramifications of it. And also understand sometimes the fix can have more side effects, or sometimes the fix can actually cause more problems, right? And I really like when you talk about the holistic view, because I'm a big fan of measuring the outcomes and measuring the output, right? It's almost like you could say, well, I want to do ABC, but then do it, measure the outcome. Did the actual resulted in more secure systems? Did the actual resulted in improved, or do you still have the same problems, or you still have the same challenges? So I think we can anchor this conversation. I think there's some really lovely topics that I would like to get into, because I think we're quite in agreement. Well, let's talk about the modern security practice, right? I think there's lots of companies who are still not there. Although I would argue that more and more, the challenge is not the concept of security as a blocker, security, it needs to be done separately. I think there's that universe, but we have to ignore it, because it's almost like they already have bigger problems, right? I think I feel that there's a new generation, it's a new world, right, who's now starting to look for, okay, but how do we do it? Like, again, if you look at some of the past summit sessions, it was a very clear, interesting line in the last year or so that the sessions start to be a lot more about scale, how to do threat modeling at scale, how to do this in a big way, how to interact with the developers, how to build security champions networks. So I think, can we start by maybe an interesting topic here, which is, I feel that, and I could almost tell that you have the past experience on this. I think we miss a big trick by not using the benign incidents, i.e. the cases when the developer or the SRE or the staff brought the stuff down, which, by the way, I don't blame them a lot of the time, right? Because we should not blame them if you make
never blame them.
Exactly.
I will have a long conversation with you about blaming people.
Not blaming in a point of view of whatever they did, it should not be their responsibility to maintain the whole infrastructure, right? Like if whatever they did here has a cascading side effects, that is the problem, not whatever happened here, right?
Well,
doesn't matter how bad it is.
Yeah.
So my first question is, shouldn't we be using those incidents, right, as a great way to improve visibility, to improve what's going on, to understand and ask the question, why didn't we detect it in the first place? Like, why did we wait it for the big, hit the iceberg before we go, or the meteorite to hit the land, to going, ooh, something was coming.
Let's add one thing in front of that. Why did it happen to begin with? Because I think why didn't we detect it is definitely one of the good questions. But the previous question to that even is, how did we allow this? How did architecture, how did development, how did we mess up? How did we miss the fact that this was a possibility way back over here?
The question I like to ask is, why do we even have that lever?
Yeah, but that's the only thing I would say about that one, is that takes you to the line of idea that we don't want those things to happen. Where actually the irony is that, in a weird way, let me play devil advocate from a business point of view, you want that to happen, right? Like, you want people to be pushing things, you want people to experiment, you want teams to be accelerating. The problem is the side effect of it, right? So
yes and no, right? The problem is not whether we want teams to accelerate and teams to be able to push the boundary. Those are very reasonable things. The problem is that if I, as an individual, have the ability, have the permission to take actions that I don't understand the consequences of, or that I shouldn't be able to do, I'm going to take them. And so the question is, why can I do that? And that's both from a security perspective and a reliability one. Again, it's, but the question sometimes is not just, why can I press that button? But why do we have that button? What is its purpose in our system? Because sometimes we've just built traps for future us. And when you say, why didn't we detect it? My first question is, well, why was it possible to do this then? Right?
That's where monitoring can help a lot, right?
What's that?
So that's where monitoring and almost like monitoring in a way that shows.
Well, so monitoring is about detection, but I'm really talking about the shift left to design. Right. I'm talking about why did we design it this way?
And I think that goes back to observability, though. Like, to be fair, as if I'm a developer and I'm on a development team and we're pushing hard for this thing that's never been done before, if I don't have good observability, and that's one of the primary assets of DataDog, frankly, if I don't have good observability as a developer, as a DevOps engineer, and I can't see the things that I'm doing, then mistakes are going to happen. And I completely agree with you 100% that those developers need to have the ability to fail, and they need to run into a wall as hard as they can in development. And occasionally things are going to happen in testing, and sure, things are going to happen in prod. And I was actually debating about whether to tell you a story, but one of the things that happens in reality is that occasionally somebody gets an order or somebody gets a request to go do a thing, and they do it, and it causes bad outcome. And I was actually thinking of a previous consulting gig where I actually was working with a company, and one of their individuals, a new person onto the team, had been asked to cut the AWS bill or figure out how to cut the AWS bill down. And so he went out and found a bunch of servers and turned them off. And sure enough, that AWS bill went down. It turned out it was the SAP cluster, not an ideal thing to turn off. Yeah. But why was he able to turn off the system? Why was the new guy, without any real background training or documentation, also issues, able to go shut down servers that didn't have appropriate tags on them to tell them what they were? There's all of these things that go into a layered security model, a layered observability model that allow you to, as the security guy, as the operations lady, as anybody that would go into this, that would need to see this thing, be able to look and evaluate what's going on and respond to it appropriately.
So here's how I view the sequence of events that should lead to that not being possible, which is the fact that we should be raising incidents, for example, when at peacetime, somebody does something with way over privileges that they need to do, right? So, and remember that technology doesn't help, right? Like, for example, for all the great things of the cloud, for all the great things of stuff, I challenge you to find people who understand AWS IAM rules, right? To understand
that's pretty rough to write.
Freaking side effects of what's going on, right? So it's all nice and good to say, you know, they should not have the capability to do that. But if you take that step back and going, can you really expect a developer, an engineer, an SRE, without a good amount of observability, to really understand the side effects of what they're doing, right? It doesn't happen. Now, the beauty of, I think, the observability world, and I think security can help to drive a lot of this, because security has a very interesting property, which is we also tend to be on the receiving end of the incidents, right? So we have a motivation, right, to actually lock things down that is a little bit different than just get it to work. So a lot of dev teams, they stop, and correctly, because that's their brief, right? They stop when it works, right? And they're happy. The happy path is perfect, right? And they don't understand, they don't have enough visibility to understand the side effects of what they just created.
So I think that if you've got development teams that stop when it works and don't understand what they've done, then you already have a failure in your development organization that goes beyond security, right? That's a development organization that is going to get less reliable over time. It's going to get slower to finish things over time. Like you're speaking about sort of the shift in security towards a more modern stack. Part of that should also include the shift in our development philosophy towards something much more modern and a much more modern SRE approach.
Yeah, but you
and if I find a developer who makes it work and then stops during some kind of outage, we're going to have a conversation.
Well, but you have to be careful here, right? Because the developers are working to a brief that comes from a business, right? And the irony here, especially from a security point of view, right, is if you don't fully understand the side effects of what you're creating, right? I'm not saying that they're doing a bad job, right? I'm actually saying they're doing a very good job.
Yes.
The problem was the brief, right? The problem was, and usually the problem is that you develop something for a particular environment, and because of their success, it grows and grows and grows and grows. But the pivot point, the moment where it became, hey, do you realize that what was really good and stable here, it's not over there, right?
And that's more a scale issue. Yeah, I hear you.
But also impact, right? Like look,
absolutely.
Look, a good example is, is management of keys, right? I challenge you to find a very good team today that has a very good grip on the AWS keys and the permission sets that they push their application. And in Kubernetes, it's even a freaking bigger clusterfuck, right? Because most Kubernetes barely control what's up there. Might as well, who can talk to who?
So I would push back on kind of a general concept. So I agree with you. The tech stack is one of those things that's complicated, and we can drill into the specificity of Kubernetes KMS, and we have stories for all of those things. Those are fun. But as we move to the left and we try to figure out what the overall thought here is, and what I'm pushing for and what I'd like to see happen. We talked a little bit about security champions. We talked a little bit about security training and all of that. One of the things that, if we step back and try to figure out where is the actual miss, in my opinion, the actual miss, again, kind of like we were talking before the session, is 20, 25, 30 years ago, we all decided that we were going to go ahead and segment security and development, and nary the two shall meet until production, apparently. At that point, we'll go ahead and tack security on the end of it and everything will be fine. And the concept at the time worked. I would debate with Laura. I don't think it really worked all that well. One of the things that one of my previous companies did was to set up data centers. And one of the things that we figured out was that it really was quite complex, and we were able to automate and set up a lot of the provisioning with shell scripts and things that, to be fair, we don't have to do anymore because we have wonderful things like Terraform. Yep. But all of those things, back to the 0 point, as we look at what a development architecture team ought to be, should have a security person in that team. Let me get in front of the camera here, so that as you begin to grow that organism, because we all complain about, oh, that's just, it's an organic problem. It happened over time. Well, it happened over time because you didn't have that injection of important knowledge in the whole thing. So it grew the way that it grew. And as we look at how things like, oh, now we have a Kubernetes cluster and it's all messed up and we don't, okay, great. But it has nothing to do with the technology. It has to do with that team not actually having the knowledge 2 years ago that they needed when they started. And so now the challenge is, honestly, how do we re-inject security into development? How do we get the security team and the development team, and let's be very honest, folks, that sometimes don't like each other very much, to actually have a beer or a tea and begin to work together and solve some of these problems at the root as opposed to the end point.
And it goes both ways, right? Like I as a development team, you need that security person with that knowledge of the consequences of what you're doing and the context and how you're going about them. But as a development, I'm hearing you tell me all about how complex these things are to manage. And I'm saying, well, surely you can put an abstraction layer on top of that and simplify it for people. Why have you not done that?
Yeah.
No, yeah. But look, let's just be like the only model that scales and is proven to scale is when the developers, the DevOps engineers, the risk practitioners, they are the ones who are better suited to do security. In fact, the best security professionals that I know are actually engineers. Right? By orders of magnitude. Try to hire them, right? But basically, they are the best ones. Security, in a way, should be providing some of the missing piece of the puzzle, and should be providing maybe a little bit expert knowledge, and should be empowering them. Look, and I think that's the modern way of doing it, right? In fact, even then, the aim should be to be invisible, going straight to your point, right? The best, and we have success stories. We know that. Like these days, there's no buffer overflows in a lot because we abstracted that, right? Now, a lot of the SQL injections, a lot of the cross-site scripting, a lot of vulnerabilities are starting to peter out because we're now using modern frameworks, right? That do that kind of stuff, right? So the best security in a way is an invisible security that just happens, right? The interesting point I think we were touching is the unintended consequences, which I kind of want to bring back to observability, because I think observability allows us to see those unintended consequences before they fully happen.
Yes.
Right. And the thing that I always challenge my team is that, and I tend to do this very strategically, where I tend to take a P3 and I run it as a P1, like P3 incident, medium, I run as P1. And the current analogy is like, we just had a meteorite hitting Earth, right? A house. And we're going like, hold on. We had no advance warning. We didn't saw it coming. What the hell? First of all, are there more? And why wouldn't we know about it? So for me, the bigger vulnerability is almost a systems vulnerability. It's not the fact that that happens, whatever that was, is the fact that we missed the 10 things that led to that one, that would allow us to pick it up and like go to all the mistakes the attacker did, all the mistakes the bug did on the way that led to that very visible outcome. That's what I think is the interesting part, because that allows us to address the root causes of it and all the near misses.
And I think that's where Datadog is ideal. So one of the things that I began to, so going to step out of the role that I'm in right now in Datadog and speak more as like who I was prior to this, and being the Senior Director of Incident Response, Security Operations and Disaster Recovery, which is quite the title for like basically janitor. As we get into that,
very high end,
very good janitor.
very well paid janitor.
As we get into that, though, I mean, the reality is, how do you set up a company to be able to handle this from the ground up? And one of the things that, so I was brought in as security person 2 and cloud person 1. And as we began to put the whole company together, and we grew from 35-ish to about 3,500 by the time I left, and that's a huge growth curve. But all of that happens with the concept of, how do we get started? How do I build out something that allows for that observability? And that was honestly one of the reasons I picked Datadog, because by myself, I had about 2 weeks before the first M&A transaction to get stuff set up. And that was really where I wanted to start off with. So if we start off with a really good basis of observability and have the agility to, as we talk about incidents with Laura, as we begin to look at what SRE really looks like from a global scale point of view, I need to be able to agilely evaluate the things that are occurring in multiple layers of the architecture, regardless of whether or not that's an application, or that's infrastructure, or that's the firewall, or some new system that we just purchased that I've never ever seen before, but we're going to start dumping the logs in. And from that point of view, it allowed me the flexibility, the maneuverability, even in an incident, to be able to find that one nugget of truth and then act on it. And that shortened my OODA loop time. So that's really what I felt about it. I don't know how you feel about it, Laura, but that's my 2 cents on it anyway.
No, I mean, absolutely. So when we talk a little bit more about sort of incident response, as opposed to, I'm hammering on this design for success in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Design systems that are harder to break and harder to break into. But obviously, we've built a complex thing. We don't always know what we're doing. And so the sort of second layer of that, from my perspective, is designed to have the tools that you need when something goes wrong and you don't understand it. And that really is what observability is all about. It's also, from my perspective, very much about how do you build the incident response within your organization, right? It's all about the people, not just the tools. If you have lots of great tools and 12 people doing different things at cross purposes, you're going to have a bad time. But yeah, so planning ahead for those problems that you didn't foresee and building in the observability that you need is absolutely sort of layer 2. And then sort of the third thing is what you're getting at, Dennis, the follow-up, right? I had something happen. It doesn't really matter how severe it was as an incident. I should be doing follow-up to make sure that I understand the whole sequence of events that happened in my system. And this is true, whether it's security or reliability, right? This is part of what I'm trying to get at, is like the philosophy of how we do these things really shouldn't be different in security.
Absolutely. But security adds, I think, a level of what if. It's almost like we bring user stories that sometimes don't exist in normal development, which is the adversarial, it's a bit like, but the user is never going to do that, right? But who the hell will do that, right?
There's a whole
You
meme
haven't
on
met some of
Twitter.
the users I've met, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, there's this whole meme on Twitter of, how you designed it, how users will use your product. And it's people using things in ridiculous ways, because the thing is, users absolutely will do ridiculous things you've never thought of. And whether or not their intent is adversarial, you've got to design for that. It sort of doesn't matter what their intent is.
I always felt in security, we miss a trick by not sometimes presenting a lot of the stuff we do more in that light. Like, look, we're just being a much more curious and much more, crazy user than you usually have. But let me just go back to a point I think you were making, I think is super, super cool, which is, when you add observability to a platform and you have a platform running, right? I feel that we're missing a trick by not looking at reality, like even the happy path, right? And then going, hey, do you realize, for example, like let's say an analogy of a building, do you realize between here and that place you're going for the, to get your asset or whatever your repository, you now have all these gaps, right? You could have if any of those steps go haywire, you could blow up, right? So it's almost like I'll give a very good example is in most architectures, there's a web service called get data, whatever it is, whatever is customer data, whatever there's logs, right? Inside DataDog, there's going to be a web service that get logs, right? Now, even if we just look at who calls that and what privileges they have, you could say, look, at the moment, all the happy paths are read-only. Hey, lovely. But that account has write privileges for whatever reason. That account could actually call this other web service over here, who is crazy dangerous. So I think there's a feedback loop that sometimes the reason, and I've been on the development side, very recently. Like, the reason why sometimes developers don't harden more is because they don't fully understand the side effects of hardening. Right. Because if you can lock it down, everybody would only want a system that does exactly what it says on the tin, right? And I think having visibility, it's almost like I love a mode where you can almost use the DataDog data to say, hey, you actually have these vulnerabilities by design, and actually you can protect them. And actually, I have data to show that you can protect them, because 99% or even 100% of the current user paths, they don't need these extra privileges. They don't need these access. You can lock it down, right? You can create that path, which is way more robust.
I think you're selling your development team short when you say that they don't understand the implications of hardening, or they don't understand what the benefits to them would be. I think that they absolutely understand those benefits. I think that they've had a lot of interactions with security orgs in their careers where things are being demanded for hardening that don't seem terribly useful, where the requests are coming in an unclear way, or where they're being asked for a lot of work from a lot of different places and they just don't have time. Right. It's not
context, right? But
in this context, though, I think you're absolutely right, Laura. But I do see where Dinis is coming from, like being able to overlay those Venn diagrams of web services via IAM and say, hey, look, by the way, there's this whole arc over here that you just didn't even think about, just because we had this, web service arm. Yeah. Yes. But and there really aren't many posture tools that do that. Now, there are ways to do that, and you can totally do them in whatever tool you want to use, frankly, as far as I know. But being able to go ahead and select which portions of that web service are currently being used, and that's, me coming from the AWS background, that's one of the reasons that I really liked CloudTrail, was because I could go ahead and look at, these are the things that this principal has called in the last 6 months. And now that I've got that data, I can look at this really, 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 really specific IAM policy and go, this is all this service needs. You have EC2.star in your IAM role, and that's really bad. Now you can delete the entire VPC. Well, obviously that's bad. Let's not do that. But at the same time, being able to say, look, this is all you really need. I think there are a couple of open source, and I can't remember the names of them right now. There are a couple of open source tools out there that will take the IAM logs that you've got, feed them into open source tool, and out comes an IAM policy that's strict enough to only let you do X.
But having the feedback with the observability, right? It's also,
and that's the trick,
gives confidence, right? The feedback loops, and it doesn't help that, for example, and I have pains on this, that even the IAMs in AWS, are not real time, which is really painful.
That's a different issue,
right? But that's reality, right? Like, that's just reality, right? Well, and they're complex, right? And we still don't have good graph ways of doing it. And if we now tie this back to incident response, I always take the view that at least every incident is an opportunity to measure your entire defense stack and your entire assumptions, because whatever happened to get to be an incident, i.e., it wasn't an event that you control, that you manage, etc. It means that you missed a trick in the middle.
Yes.
And if you look closely, that every major incident is preceded by hundreds or dozens of
little
smaller
failures
ones that you missed, that it didn't cause enough damage to raise it. But if we can start paying attention to those ones and realize, look, we had tons and tons and tons of near misses, right? All he needs is for the attacker to go left. All he needs is for the developer to make this mistake. All he needs is for that to happen. And then you have this catastrophic sequence of events, right? I think that observability and that embracement of everybody of that, from developers to managers to execs to security, will build a way more resilient ecosystem.
Well, what you're talking about is, so incident response is the thing you do on that crappy Monday morning when you're scared and things are going crazy, and security incident response is one layer above that, even potentially, where now you've got somebody working against you and, oh my God, we're all gonna, okay, you get it. But I would debate with you that incident response isn't that Monday morning, really. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
We've got to go handle the incident. It's the ambulance ride. It's the EMT taking care of the problem.
But did that EMT
EMT,
take a whole lot of classes beforehand?
right? Like there's a whole lot of stuff that happens before that Monday morning, and the stuff that happens there is a change to development. We're looking at now we need functional requirements that involve synthetic tests through our data, that involve posture analysis for our IAM policies. All of those things should be happening. And if you have a really good incident response team, they're literally taking pictures of these things, putting them in notebooks and saying, hey, look, this thing occurred. I need you to go ahead and evaluate this. And this is now a functional requirement that goes into your next story. And when you complete the story, the checkoff is, hey, I get it. Not only do I have a positive, hey, this works, I've also got a, hey, this doesn't work. And I've proven it, and it happens every 20 minutes so that I can evaluate whether or not my application, my infrastructure, take your pick all the way down the stack, is actually still doing the thing we want it to do. Now, as geeky government DoD Nate that does development and architecture and all of that, not only do I want that, but I want to make sure that all of those compliance check marks are still there too. So I want to know that my stuff is hardened. I want to make sure that the developers are checking in code appropriately, tagging things appropriately. And I can go to a page and see, yes, I have a list of green check marks and I don't have to worry today. Everything's working the right way. And I would argue that the GRC portion of that, all the way back to a bunch of people sitting at a table and going, how do we want our KMS system to work? And trying to figure out and make sure that all of those policies are actually written correctly so that they push through and make appropriate compliance policies, so that they push through and make appropriate story functional requirements, so that they push through and make an epic that actually works together, so that they launch in production and it actually works the way we expect it to. That's the trick.
If you launch in production and it works the way that you expect it to on the first try, I want to know where your secret sauce is.
Oh no, come on, these days,
Fair enough.
these days is all about, failing fast, right? Like, in fact, I even have parts of the business who are now funding their startups, right? Like that's how much the business is now embracing the new model, right? So, and actually, I'm going to do a session. In fact, Nate, I don't know how much you've seen of the stuff I've published, over the past on Jira and Graph, right? And actually, this is something that if you guys can take a feature request for DataDog, right? I still feel that most security tools miss a trick by not thinking of the graph of the organization that they can create, right? Like, I'll give a very simple example. Like, you already have in your tool the best org charts, right, in the business, because you actually know who's doing what, who's connected to what, who's doing the stuff, etc. Which I guarantee you that half the businesses, even if they knew at a moment in time, eventually it falls away. So one of the things we're doing now is really cool. So we use Jira for this, but we're creating that graph, right? And what we actually do is we use Jira projects, but one per type. So what we have is we have Jira projects for project, right? For program, for task, for incident, for event, for entity, for business action, for role, for person, all of that. Every one of those is a little object. And the idea is to start to connect those dots, right? The idea is, for example, when we want to make a decision based on risk, we have a direct line between that top level of risk to the why it matters. I like the 5 whys for risks, but then incidents I always use the incidents as almost the strongest currency, because it's all nice and good to say in security this could happen, which pisses me off dramatically, because it's like, where the fuck is the data, right? Like, come on, in security you can't. The first thing
certainly a meteor could hit your house. That's physically possible, but
exactly right. Like in security, we love to come up with these crazy scenarios. Like, no, let's look at the data, right? And if the data supports that, then you should do something. So again, that data is in something like buried in the middle of DataDog, right? And it will be buried on both cases. You will be buried in the real incidents that you can bubble up, but also on all those near misses that are all those times where that could have actually happened, but it didn't happen, right? And you get away with it until, of course, a real incident.
Laura, I'm dying to talk about notebooks. I will let you do that.
Talk about notebooks.
Oh, I love books.
Okay.
I love it.
I apologize. I just spoke. I feel like politely, it's your turn.
Go for it. I'm the biggest fan. The best incident response plans, the best models I've seen are all based on notebooks. because
So-
it's a great way to execute it. So,
Yeah,
Laura,
but-
give us a good.
No, I totally agree.
Nathan, I want to hear Nathan talk about notebooks, and then I'll talk about how actually we wind up using them as well on our incident responses. But
So I really, so when I got hired, one of the things that they had me do was you've got to come up with a cute little project that you think DataDog should do. And one of the things I came up with was, I really like the notebooks function as
So
the
you're the one I need to
security.
thank for the notebooks in there.
No, God, no. God, no. They came up with it all on their own. I did this and like a week later they released it and looked at me and laughed. But
Oh, you mean this?
yeah, oh, you mean this? Yeah, we did that. But no, as the senior director, the geeky senior director that's looking at these things happening, looking at the incidents the way you're talking about them, one of the things I really liked was the fact that I could put a bunch of stuff in a box and connect it back to a Jira ticket and say, look, this is what we just did. And this is now we called it correction of error, but you might call it postmortem, you might call it whatever you do in your company. But this is the postmortem. This is why we decided this was important. By the way, here's your customer data. This is how many customers this actually affected.
Yeah.
And being able to put that in a box and attach it to a ticket and say, seriously, this is why, as we triage tickets, because let's be honest, it's always a handoff. It is always how much money do we have? How much time do we have? And what do we need to do to make our customers happy? Right. And as we begin to play this card game, it's really cool to be able to say, this is the actual reality of the thing that happened last week. And by the way, these are the things that we need to go ahead and mitigate. And maybe you're a business and you decide you're going to accept the risk on this other thing because you think it's outside. Dude, that's totally your call. But at least have the appropriate data to know that you're making the right call or a call that's good for you.
Absolutely. Look, I couldn't.
So
agree more.
internally, in fact, we do use notebooks for all of these things. And in particular, we use them for postmortems. In fact, if you are looking at the DataDog incident app, which highly recommend, and it has really cool features coming that I can't talk about yet, but they're really cool. But we have an incident app that's designed for, helping coordinate your incident response. And in particular, understanding what tasks need to happen and all of those coordinations that go into your incident response. And then when it's over and you've resolved the incident, it generates a postmortem in notebooks. There's a bunch of cross-linking between those that you can take the data from the incident directly and put it automatically into your postmortem that you can then add a bunch of text and context to.
So give us some examples, right, of notebooks you create, right? Because one of the things that I always try to challenge the team is that, is for them to leave an audit trail of what they do, right? And I guess I found recently an interesting maybe experience that I had that made me change a lot is, again, on my exploitation days, I went from finding tons of stuff where the name of the game was, can you find enough shit so they pay you and you go, hey, great job, right? And then they never ask the question, is it secure? To being given more and more and more secure applications. And then also where the problems were more esoteric. You would go on a tangent and then you actually had to come back, ooh, what was that little signal here? And then go on that. And then what I really learned was I became really good at almost building tools during the incident and also describing that. So when I saw a notebook, I was like, this is exactly what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
And I think having the discipline to go slow, but leave that trail behind. And sometimes even what you've done, or what you haven't found, i.e. the places you go that you don't find a positive answer, they are as important as, what you find. Like just a final little example, like in some of the instances we have, one of the questions we have to answer is, do we have a data breach problem? Do we have, is this a much wider problem? So ironically, the answer of what we didn't find is as important as what we find. Because if you go and say, oh, we only found this, and I go, but you only found this because you happened to hit on that, or did you look all of here? And yeah, that was the thing. So give us some good examples of notebooks that you've kind of leave that trail behind of your thinking, right? That then becomes, your postmortem, but also your great learning tool for the next engineer and for somebody else to help, or even the developers to do it themselves, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. All of our postmortems look this way, right? They're an interleaving of the story of what happened in the sense of, so we ask our developers when they're writing a postmortem for a reliability incident or a security incident, to start from sort of the initial decisions that were made. So for example, the one that I'm helping out with this week, the initial thing that happened was somebody edited a monitor in a way that didn't actually have the behavior that they expected. back in, I think, July. And it stopped going off, but nobody had noticed that there was a problem, right? And then a database filled up and it caused them an issue. And, that happened last week. That was when the database finally filled up and caused an issue.
Yeah.
And then we discovered that we didn't have workarounds for some of these problems and things along those lines, right? And so the postmortem starts with, here's the monitor that we changed. Let's link to that. Here's the data showing the database filling up. Here's where the monitor used to go off. Now it doesn't.
Yep.
Now we walk through, okay, so now the database fills up. Here's, following that down our tech stack, what happens as that happens. Here it is in graphs, in data. And then here's other impacts of that, right? People can't log in over here. And this was all internal tooling, so not a customer visible incident.
But all of that is data driven, right? It's fact-based.
Yeah,
Absolutely, and it should always be fact-based, and it should always follow that complete trail. But that's what our postmortems look like, and they're built around notebooks, and we use the notebooks for.
What about doing investigations? What about notebooks that you create?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we've got a longer,
a bit more messy, but they represent almost what you are.
Yes.
And then
yeah,
do you
absolutely.
have pre-baked notebooks, which is when this happens, this is instead of having a notebook as a series of tasks, here's almost a notebook that you're going to run.
Yep.
That each of these gives you the answer, but you already capture the answer in the cells, right?
You would almost
so
call it a run book.
Yeah,
Oh,
we would
yeah.
call that a run book. And we absolutely have those. In fact, we mostly link to them from the monitor that's going to go off. So you just go directly to the run book that is the notebook that's got what you need.
Have you published them? Because I just had a quick look. I haven't seen a lot of interesting, I see a lot of good examples of the kind of more curated, this is how you use technology, this other thing. I almost would like to see the more raw version of it, which is, this is what created doing it. This is like what a real incident.
Yeah,
looks like.
so I Nathan, that would be on you and other members of our community team to
Yeah.
decide what we'd be interested in publishing there. These are often very messy. They've often got a lot of internal data that we don't really want to share.
Oh.
By the time there's something that we're comfortable sort of publishing to the outside, they're going to have been somewhat curated. That's just sort of the nature of the beast. We absolutely do have people who, mid-incident, they need to communicate about what they're looking at and what hypotheses they're forming. They'll spin up a quick notebook to do that.
Nate, I'm telling you, as a user, that will help a lot.
No, you're
Like,
totally right. And-
My biggest challenge with, for example, my team, I would say, is I need good examples, right?
Mhm.
And ironically, the best examples I had was in the previous company, and I cannot bring them in, right? But also I need the small to the large examples, right? Like
Right.
even like simple wins, right? Here's what a simple notebook is. Remember that not everybody uses notebooks, right? Not everybody has
Yeah.
that mindset, right? And it's actually really a mindset that you want to change. So even if you took, Nate, that run book and just
Yes.
recreated with random data, it almost
I-
the data doesn't matter.
Yeah.
What matters is the sequence. Even the messiness of it is actually what I would say is very interesting. The rabbit holes that you went. So then you even like, it'll be fascinating. We see 3 different playbooks or run books, which is, this is the first time we encountered it. This is the second time. This is the third time. Now, look at how evolved the playbook is. Look at how, hey, look, the things we do now, the first 3 things we do now in our 3rd generation of playbook actually were done in 5th, 7th, and 20th position in that playbook. But seeing that evolution, I think also helps a lot of people see the picture. Because if you only show them the creator, they're going, they don't see it. Like they go, it's too much.
It's a little hard to show that as well, just because the underlying system is evolving. So one of the reasons that our runbooks change frequently is because everything's always changing in the underlying system. And so being able to say, this is because we've curated this process more. Well, first of all, if you're running this runbook often enough that you're curating it to be cleaner over time, I've got some questions about why you haven't automated the response or made it go away. But on top of that, right, just the underlying tech stack is changing, and the underlying, not just your understanding of the system, but the system itself is changing. And so that's a hard story to tell.
Can we just expand actually on that one? Because there's a little, so in the past, I've used Jira as a state machine, and I use notebooks as a state machine. I haven't got to the point where I would say it's very well integrated, but if you look at the example you're saying, ideally, if you think about the automated response, right? Like again, the automated response, it can't be black magic, right? Or else nobody
No.
trusts it, right? So in
Well-
the past, I've used Jira almost as a state
Yes.
machine where almost the scripts we're keeping the Jira ticket updated. And
Yes.
almost like if you want to understand why something happened, although the Jira ticket might even be closed automatically, you got it there. But the
Well-
best example I've seen is actually a notebook that
Yes.
gets executed. And that's your event
Right.
handling, right?
And that's the Jupyter notebook concept that
Yeah.
Ben out of Australia, I can't remember his last name. Ben and myself, we talked about it at AWS, and a lot of the run books that I've done and handed out, we handed out a whole bunch of them at AWS and just said, here you go. The downside of that action that I really frankly hadn't considered, and the failure of doing that, was honestly that people started following them almost programmatically. And the reality of many of the things that Laura's talking about are when we create run books, we have to make sure that people feel comfortable enough with those run books to change them as they go.
Yeah, of course.
And a lot of people don't. And
Some of
so
them-
getting to the point where we have a Jupyter notebook or a notebook inside of DataDog or something else that allows us to begin to follow that pattern. And I think you're totally right. You can totally use Jira as a human state machine. And it becomes kind of a humans or robots scenario where I'm going to give Laura a ticket, I'm going to give Dennis a ticket, and you guys go do a thing. And that's totally cool. And now I have
Frankly, if you are using your humans as robots, you
It's
have
not a
made
good thing.
very poor use of your humans. Humans
Yeah,
are
yeah.
way more
That's
expensive.
exactly.
So by the way, so in this case, when I say state machine, there's no human interaction, right? What you
I
do is
I was using your term because like,
Yeah, yeah,
no, and I get you, like, it's a really good way to keep track of different lines of work. And I really like Jira for that. And I really like notebooks for that. And I really like the ability to keep track of, because generally I have multiple lines of
Yeah.
actual functionality inside of an incident.
and
And I
those
have to be
two-
able to hop
You say
between
that nobody trusts your automation if it's a black box, but again, like I think, your automation can be observable through something aside from Jira. Like
Yeah.
we generally monitor our automation, right? That's
Sure,
that's
but
how it's
it
not
needs to be
a black
captured
box.
somewhere,
We put
right?
observability on it.
Yeah. But what I'm saying,
Exactly.
but look, but even if the observability is a Datadog query, right? Again, you can use Datadog as a state machine, right?
Yes,
You can-
absolutely.
You can be generating logs that are just designed to be visualized, so
Yep.
you can see the sequence of events, right? In fact,
Exactly.
the interesting step is that when you have the decision trees happening as automatic as you can, until the point, oh, now we need a human. Oh, now this is not,
Use the
and-
human for what the human's good for, and use the robot for what the robot's good for, and then go do a thing.
Absolutely.
And make
Yeah,
sure the
but-
communication is in a visible central location.
Yes.
Yes.
But I also push back. I push back on this state machine concept because sometimes it's the best you can do. But again, you want to be designing your system so that it doesn't fail this way, right? The thing that we often do in an opsy kind of way or in a DevOpsy kind of way, and this is one of the ways that SRE really diverges from DevOps, is we have some repeating thing, something that goes wrong the same way. And DevOps is all about, let's build a state machine, let's automate that response. And SRE is about, why does it keep breaking that way? Can we make it stop breaking like that?
Yeah.
And those are really different philosophies, right?
Yeah.
And one of the dangers of let's build a state machine is that you get into this state where you built this ever more complex system with ever more fragile breaking points because you've just added more and more automation on top of something that was kind of broken.
But then you're going to have side effects, right? But I completely, and again, I think security.
You have side effects from your automation of fixing the problem too. Like everything has side effects. Fix
Yeah,
the
but
underlying problem because
I agree, and that's where the goal should be, right? That's why look. I'm the first one to say that I think more complexity, a complex system, is the worst thing you can do, right? Like security, we should reward simplicity. I love this definition from one of my friends, Cesus, who says the job of security is to simplify the organization. That's really how you get security, right? So
Yes.
again,
Well,
I think.
Sort of, but yeah.
Well, you get, because the simpler it is,
Yeah.
the less moving parts,
Yeah.
the less, a system that has an AWS key with the exact permissions, I would argue, is simpler, right, than a system that have bazillions of things, because it's like refactoring, right? You're refactoring to the point where it's nice and clean, right?
I think there's something about that is, there's a, what's the right word for it? There's a prettiness, there's a beauty to the simplicity of a perfectly running system. And even if it's a horribly complex system, like let's talk about any of the OT systems, take your pick of really complicated, crazy multinational things that have to all be automated. as long as you've got a very beautiful orchestration that runs the right way and you have observability
Yep.
to all of these things, then you can tell whether or not it's appropriately secure. And I think that's really, if I was to cap what you set off, and I sort of agree with it, but there's that edge of like, I've worked on some systems that have to be complex because they're so large and they do some crazy things. But at the same time, there's that moment of perfection when it's as simple as it can be to do the job. Elegant, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
It's elegantly designed and architected, and it does that perfect thing in a perfect way.
Yeah.
And because of its elegance, it is indeed secure.
And I love graphs, because if you graph both systems, right, one would look lovely, the other will be like, right?
Yeah.
And this one is the one we need to do something about, right? And
Yeah.
again, Laura, when you say we cannot add more automation to deal with the part of this, it's like, yes, we want to be.
I mean, we
pushing.
can, we do it all the time.
We do
I
it all the
just
time.
push
but
back against doing
oh,
it.
completely. Look, we're on the hour. I had lots of fun. I think this was great. You know, let's do a couple more of these if you guys are up for it. I think what I would love to do is to actually look at some examples. So maybe, you know, Mark and Laura, can I challenge you to actually bring a couple of cool examples?
Well, to be
Like,
fair, I was
on
going to
top
show
of
you my
notebooks.
ubiquity setup at the house, honestly, Dennis.
No, I'm talking about notebooks.
Oh, well, that's another thing that we could have talked about. That's actually in the other screen, just in case we got there. But
Exactly. Brilliant. Look, thanks for coming. And I'll
Yep.
see you at the next session this summit.
bye.
Thank you.